Welcome back to the Retro Vault, where we'll be looking at and diving into stories from games of old. In this episode, we'll be going pure classic 90s horror and looking at the story from not only Clock Tower: The First Fear, but also its sequel, Clock Tower from the PlayStation 1. As many of you know if you've been following the channel, I've been on a bit of a quest the last few months to try and source some of the most rare horror games that, to a collector, are essentially horror gaming's holy grails. I'm a big fan of playing these titles how they were meant to be played, in their original disc form on the original console. I know you can play them on emulators these days, but there's just something nice to me about playing the authentic game. Recently, I was able to find and pick up all the Clock Tower games. I started by picking up the Japanese imports of Clock Tower 2 and Ghost Head at a local games market, hoping that there'd be an English language option, but nope. I then had to shell out for the extremely rare English language versions instead. Now, the games did confuse me at first, as Clock Tower 1 for the English, European and American releases was actually Clock Tower 2 in Japan, as their series continued on after Clock Tower: The First Fear, which was essentially a prologue, whereas ours, quite strangely, did not. That means Clock Tower 2 for us was Ghost Head in Japan. There was also Clock Tower 3. The First Fear was pretty inaccessible as it released on the SNES back in 1995. But that wasn't until it received a digital release and a limited run of physical editions so that players could experience the prologue for themselves. In terms of story links between the games, they are pretty separate, and Clock Tower 1 has nothing to do with 2, and 1 and 2 have little or nothing to do with 3. I know, pretty strange franchise. For that reason, this video is just going to be the story of Clock Tower: The First Fear and Clock Tower 1 for the PlayStation 1, as those two games are linked. The explanation for First Fear will also follow what is widely considered by the community and the fandom to be the canon ending, as there are actually 9 endings for First Fear and 10 for Clock Tower 1, but I do think I've waffled on enough, so let's get into the story. It's September 1995, and Jennifer Simpson, a 14-year-old orphan girl who is living at Granite Orphanage in Norway, has been adopted by a wealthy but very private and reclusive man by the name of Simon Barrows, along with her fellow orphans and friends Laura, Anne, and Lottie. They are taken there by their teacher Mary, and they are to live with Simon Barrows in his large mansion, which is often called the Clock Tower on account of it having a literal, massive clock tower attached to it. With Mary and the girls heading to the mansion, Jennifer has a lot of questions for Mary, and she's told that the mansion is a very nice place. Inside, Mary tells the girls to wait inside the foyer, and she goes off in search of Simon. She takes quite a long time and she doesn't return, so Jennifer offers to go off in search of Mary. Jennifer then hears a loud scream. She heads back to the foyer to find the lights off and the girls are gone. Jennifer has no option but to explore the mansion and try and find where her friends are, or what happened to them. Jennifer discovers something horrific. Either she finds Laura in the bathroom dead or behind a suit of armour in the living room, or she is startled by Anne falling through the skylight, having been murdered. After finding either of them, she is stalked and chased by what appears to be a deformed child wielding a giant pair of scissors. This is Scissorman. Exploring the mansion and doing her best to evade Scissorman, she encounters creepy things such as hearing the phone ringing, but upon inspecting it, the wire has been cut. Now, one of two things can happen next, depending on Jennifer's actions. Eventually, she'll see Mary, who assures her that even though the two girls, Laura and Anne, are dead, everything will be fine, and Mary offers Jennifer a drink to calm her nerves. Turns out that Mary really is quite evil, and the drink she gives to Jennifer is actually spiked, and Jennifer passes out, waking up later inside a cage. An emaciated, insane man is in there with her, and it's Simon Barrows, the man who had adopted the girls. He's been imprisoned by Mary, and for quite some time too. On her adventures exploring the mansion, Jennifer may have had the chance to pick up some ham. And this is a good thing, as if she doesn't have any food on her, the extremely hungry Simon ends up cannibalizing her. Giving Simon the ham keeps him at bay for now, but Jennifer needs to get out of there. If Jennifer was unable to find a key earlier on for this specific cage, then the remaining of her friends, Lottie, runs into the room and unlocks the door for Jennifer. Lottie then says that they need to get out of there before Mary returns. Lottie runs out of the room, but Jennifer hears a scream and a gunshot, resulting in the death of Lottie. Jennifer grabs a plank of wood and she gives Mary a whack around the skull with it, knocking her out, and Jennifer runs out of there. She's now in the mansion's courtyard. The other path that Jennifer could have taken, instead of seeing Mary and getting spiked by the drink, was to enter a secret room in the West Wing where she finds her father, Walter's dead body, which has clearly been there for some time. This path provides more information into Mary. It turns out that Walter, a doctor, had helped Mary, as Mary is a Barrows. She was pregnant at one point, and she discovered that her 2 unborn children, who would be named Bobby and Dan Barrows, were both demonic children. Walter, of course, knew too much to be allowed to leave the mansion, so he was imprisoned in the room and was forced to help deliver the 2 babies. More on them later. Through exploring and finding ways to escape and find out what on earth is happening in the mansion, Jennifer comes across strange murals, as well as signs that Mary has been heavily involved and engaged in occult practices, which explains why she had given birth to 2 demon babies. She also discovers at some point that Scissor Man is Bobby Barrows, one of Mary's children. After fighting off a possessed doll in Bobby Barrows' bedroom, she obtains a key along with a demon idol statue and opens up a secret door which leads to some catacombs underneath the mansion. She spots Mary wearing a hooded robe and walking past a guard dog that tries to attack Jennifer if she attempts to walk past it. If she earlier found the black robe and the perfume, she is able to walk past the dog as it recognizes the smell of Mary's perfume. Further into the catacombs, depending on her actions earlier on, she may or may not find Lottie there. If Lottie didn't die in the shed, therefore not being shot by Mary, she is lying in the catacombs, dying. She tells Jennifer how she can kill Bobby before passing away. Otherwise, if Lottie died earlier on, Jennifer has to find this information out herself, and it involves the clock tower. Either way, she comes across a curtain down there. Pulling back the curtains, she finds the other twin there, a monstrous Dan Barrows, also referred to as the Cradle Under the Star. Dan chases Jennifer as she scrambles up a slope, but she knocks a can of fuel over, and it ignites upon touching a naked flame from a candle, and sets Dan alight, and he cooks. Jennifer then uses an elevator to escape the catacombs. If Jennifer selects the 3rd floor of the elevator, she is pursued by Bobby. She turns on the clock tower switches, and Bobby falls to his death. Mary shows up furious and tries to attack Jennifer, but Jennifer pushes her into the switches, electrocuting and killing Mary. Now for ending C, considered to be the true canon ending, Jennifer selects the 2nd floor of the elevator and runs into Mary, who once again attempts to kill her. Evading Mary and using the information she found out about how instrumental the clock tower is in defeating Bobby Barrows, she heads up the ladder of the clock tower whilst being pursued by Mary, who of course is desperate to protect her son. Jennifer gives her a kick to the face, and Mary falls off the ladder, falling to her death. At the top of the clock tower, Bobby Barrows is there. He really wants her dead now that she's killed his mother and his brother. Jennifer activates the clock tower, which causes Bobby Barrows to recoil in pain as the bells ring out, and just as in ending B, he falls to his death from the top of the tower. Afterwards, with Mary, Bobby and Dan dead, the ordeal is over. Or is it? Something rises from the mass of burnt flesh that used to be Dan Barrows. The game then ends. So, as you can see, I tried to keep the explanation as simple as possible and in line with the canon by explaining different scenarios, but also in a way not to confuse the narrative. For example, at one point Jennifer can simply drive away from the mansion after seeing her friends get killed, but she is killed by the Scissor Man. So in the aftermath of this, Jennifer was the sole survivor of the clock tower incident. The clock tower murders were widely covered on the news, and poor Jennifer had lost some of her memory of the incident due to the trauma of being hunted down by Scissor Man and by Mary Barrows too. Jennifer, who remember is an orphan, was taken in by Helen Maxwell, an assistant professor of criminal psychology who was investigating the clock tower case. Helen then became Jennifer's legal guardian. Before we continue on with the story, please note that there are 2 scenarios for this game. There is Jennifer's scenario and Helen's scenario. They don't take place together, they are separate stories, each with 5 endings. For ease of storytelling, we'll cover ending A and go over the other alternate endings afterwards. People do note that there is actually no confirmed canon to the endings to this game, so feel free to make up your own mind on which one you prefer. The director of the game, Hifumi Kawano, even called ending A the Hollywood ending. A comment below with your headcanon if you wish. But let's continue on. It's now December of 1996, and it's been just over a year since the clock tower murders. Jennifer is in Oslo, Norway, and is undergoing treatment at a university research building. She's under the care of Helen's boss, Professor Barton, who is the professor of criminal psychology there at the university. Jennifer is there in an attempt to try and cope with the trauma of what she went through the previous year, and Professor Barton also hopes to gain some insight into the mystery of the Scissor Man. Barton is trying to achieve this through hypnotherapy. However, it's having more of a detrimental effect on Jennifer's psyche than a positive one. Helen ends the therapy session and says that she's going to take Jennifer home. Stepping out of his office, Barton speaks with his staff, and he also examines the demon statue that was taken from the scene of the murders, and he says that they should get an expert opinion on it. He also inspects the cheap rubber mask that Scissorman used in order to conceal his true identity. Barton heads outside the office and speaks with another researcher called Harris. Harris tells Professor Barton that the reporter from some tabloid is downstairs and wishes to ask him some questions about the case. And Harris reveals that he's got a bit of a weird obsession with Jennifer. Heading down to meet the reporter named Nolan, who is with his cameraman Tim, Barton is a bit prickly, but nonetheless answers Nolan's questions. He says that Jennifer's testimony lacks credibility due to her memory loss. There's still some debate as to whether or not the Scissor Man even exists. After this meeting, Barton heads back to the office and speaks with Harris again. He states that the other survivor of the Clock Tower murders is in the therapy room. They also discuss the statue and the fact they are to have it looked at by someone who knows what exactly the statue is. The statue can either be sent to Rick, a former butler who last worked at the Barrows mansion over 10 years ago, or to a Dr. Sullivan, who is an expert on these artifacts and is the curator at the library. Choosing where to send it, Barton heads into the therapy room and speaks with Edward, a 10-year-old boy who claims to have survived Scissorman's rampage in the mansion and is being accompanied by his teacher from the Granite Orphanage, Kay Satterwhite. Edward is not his real name, but is a name given to him as, like Jennifer, he appeared to have suffered memory loss from the trauma. Professor Barton then begins his examination of Edward. Sometime later, Jennifer goes to the university to see Helen. Helen explains that she'll be a bit late going home later on, as she says that her hard drive crashed and she lost all her data on it, and she needs to get it restored. Jennifer leaves and heads to the Norway International Hotel, where she meets Kay, along with Edward, and Kay says that Edward speaking with Jennifer may jog his memory. Jennifer agrees to visit Edward as often as she can. After this, Jennifer heads back home and has a conversation with Nolan, who has been waiting for her, and he tells her about how obsessed he's become with the case. He asks Jennifer out on a date, which is a bit creepy seeing as he's 26 and she's 15, but she accepts his offer of dinner. After their dinner, Jennifer is walking the short distance back home. It's dark and she feels like someone is following her. Continuing on down the street, she freaks out and runs towards the university building and speaks with a security guard. Out of nowhere, he's brutally killed by Scissorman. He's back, and Jennifer runs inside the building. Being pursued, she hides from Scissorman and waits until he's gone. She desperately needs to find a way out, and after finding the dead bodies of a researcher named Rose and another security guard, she finds a key for an emergency ladder and uses it to escape the building. The following day, Jennifer and Helen go and visit Stan Gotts, the assistant inspector who is the one investigating the case. He is annoyed that there's another mass murder before they've even solved the case. Gotts is understandably concerned about the headlines and the subsequent panic. Gotts is doubting Jennifer's insistence that she was once again hunted by the Scissor Man, but Helen believes her. She says they need to try and find some way that they can destroy him. After this, Jennifer heads to the Oslo Weekly newspaper company and speaks with Nolan's cameraman Tim. He explains that Nolan is not there and that he'd just left to look for Jennifer and that she should come back later. So in the meantime, she goes to the university to speak with Helen again. She says that she was just about to go and try and track down the demon statue. She mentions that Professor Barton had the statue, but that he has been called away on some police business. She states that one of two people could have it. And remember, these two people are Rick, the former butler, or Dr. Sullivan at the library. Since she doesn't know who Rick is, she says she'll go to the library and ask about the statue there, and to research some more about the Scissor Man. Jennifer says that she'll try and find out more about Rick, and she then departs and goes back to the newspaper company again. Nolan is there now, and he learns about Helen going to the library to look for the statue. He offers to go and see this Rick, as he's found out where he lives, and to inquire about the statue. Here is where the first ending comes into play. Alright, so this ending is tied to the decision the player made earlier on in choosing where Professor Barton would send the statue, to Rick or to Dr. Sullivan at the library. Whatever the player chooses in order to achieve this ending, the player must go against their earlier decision. In my playthrough for Jennifer, I sent the statue to Rick, So if Jennifer declines Nolan's help in asking Rick about the statue, the gameplay will switch to Helen going to the library to ask Dr. Sullivan about it. Heading into the library, Helen sees Edward there, and he says that he's there because he was bored at the hotel. She eventually speaks with Dr. Sullivan, who gives her the key to the reading room so she can do her research. Asking about the statue, of course, it's not there, and Dr. Sullivan does not recall the professor leaving it with him. Anyway, heading into the reading room, Helen finds a history book on the Lords of Northern England and sits down to read. Hours later, the receptionist informs Helen that the library will be closing. Exiting the room, the clock tower bells start ringing out, and this is not normal. Dr. Sullivan goes to check it out, along with Helen, and sticking his head out and taking a look, Dr. Sullivan, quite literally, loses his head. Lo and behold, out comes Scissorman. Evading him, Helen sees the dead receptionist and she hides, and she also discovers Edward there, and he's scared. Taking him to the reading room to hide, Helen finds a vent cover, and going to the front desk to find a screwdriver, she finds out that the police are outside. Finding a screwdriver, she unscrews the vent cover and lets Edward out. She then walks back through the library and sees Assistant Inspector Gotts. Helen then collapses into Gotts' arms. Due to them not being able to track down the statue, Jennifer sits and writes about how, since they weren't able to obtain the statue, all their leads have come to a dead end. She then hears the unmistakable sound of the Scissorman's giant scissors. And that is ending E. Obviously the scenario is different depending on where the statue was sent, but let's continue on from the decision where Nolan offers to help Jennifer. If Jennifer asks Nolan to inquire about the statue, then he will go to Rick's house in the suburbs. After interviewing Rick, he mentions a castle called Barrows Castle, which is in England. The Barrows family were last based there over 80 years ago, upon them moving to Norway. Rick says that a monster was born in the castle that terrorized the local children, and Nolan compares this to Scissorman. He explains that the monster was killed by his father, who was the head of the household. Rick says that he's got the location of the castle somewhere there in the house. However, Rick is killed by a falling chandelier in his home. With the house blacked out and dark, Nolan hears the sound of scissors and has to hide in the bathroom. After Scissorman has left, he searches the house for the location of the Barrows Castle and the statue. He finds the statue in an upstairs cupboard and finds the location of the castle in the kitchen. And after dealing with a very strange scenario in the kitchen, he then leaves, having gotten everything he needed. With Nolan back, Jennifer goes to see him at the newspaper company. He explains his ordeal with Scissorman and that Rick was killed. Nolan hands the statue over to Jennifer, and after Nolan tells her the location of the Barrows Castle, they all say they'll go to England and see what they can discover about Scissorman. Jennifer goes round and gathers everyone else, including Assistant Inspector Gotts, Professor Barton, who is especially eager to go, Kay and Edward, researchers Harris and Beth, and of course Helen, and they all set off for Oslo Airport. After their flight and landing, they make their way to the location of the castle and set up camp. But it's not long before they are all attacked by the Scissorman and are all split up. Jennifer has been tied up and is about to be attacked by Scissorman, but he stops and is revealed to be Harris. With Jennifer thinking that this is some kind of joke, Harris says that Scissorman told him that if he kidnapped Jennifer, then he would give her to him. I know, super creepy. Harris says that Scissorman wanted him to dress as the Scissorman and kill people. So therefore, the people that have died, the security guards, Rose, the people at the library, they've all been killed by Harris. Jennifer backs away as Harris is killed by the real Scissorman. He then hunts Jennifer, but she is able to push a clothes rack on top of him, and she then escapes him. In the neighbouring room, a library, Jennifer finds a piece of paper which features a language that she does not recognise. Jennifer must now attempt to find the other survivors and to discover more about who the real Scissorman is. Moving through the chapel, Jennifer discovers Gotts lying on the floor in what seems to be a torture room. He's hurt, but it's not too serious. Picking up a candle, Jennifer also uses a key and a hidden staircase descends. Moving up it, she crawls through a small tunnel and comes out from a fireplace. She then moves out into the entrance hall. Jennifer finds Professor Barton sitting against the tree in the courtyard. He translates the note as a passphrase to open some door which is written in Latin. She also finds Beth and she's terrified and hiding in the wine cellar. She also finds Helen, who had been trapped inside a large box, and after being chased by the Scissorman, Jennifer finds Nolan, who is injured having hurt his leg and who is sitting inside a room full of bones. They both then see the ghosts of children that have been killed by one of the previous versions of the Scissorman. Yep, versions of him, but we'll get to that in a bit. Leaving Nolan there, Jennifer carries on exploring the castle. Throughout the castle, finding keys and unlocking doors, Jennifer finds a strange book with a cover made of copper, an old lambskin parchment showing the Barrows family genealogy, featuring a name Quentin Barrows, which has been circled with the word traitor written next to it. She finds a portrait of Quentin Barrows and a note behind it, stating that he left a map of the castle in the library. He hopes that people may discover the door and can expel the devil children from the world. She finds a sketched map hidden inside the fireplace, which mentions a hidden passage in the fountain. Descending a strange hallway, she also finds a ceremonial dagger in front of an odd altar as well, before being attacked by a zombie. With all this information on hand, Jennifer can go to check out the fountain. She drains it and then heads down the ladder. Walking down another tunnel, Jennifer hears the voice of Kay behind it, screaming for Edward to stop. Going through the door, Kay is dead and Scissorman is revealed to have been Edward. Edward is actually Dan Barrows. After Jennifer had burned Dan, the monstrosity back in Norway, you'll remember that something emerged from the mass of burned flesh. Well, that was Dan, reborn, essentially. Scissorman attempts to attack Jennifer, but Nolan shows up and distracts him momentarily. Scissorman chases Jennifer across the bridge and she sees the massive doors, the doors that Quentin Barrows mentioned in his notes. Placing the demon idol statue on the altar and speaking the words she had translated by Professor Barrows, Jennifer manages to open the doors. Whatever energy is behind those doors, it tries to pull Scissorman into the vortex, but Jennifer is grabbed by him. Using the dagger she got from the other altar, she stabs Scissorman with it. He flies into the vortex, and Jennifer survives. Afterwards, with Nolan in the wreckage, they are both found by Helen and the other survivors, along with the local authorities, and the game then ends. But there are still 3 other endings. For ending B, if Jennifer never found the dagger in the altar room, the same thing happens as ending A, except Jennifer does not have the dagger, so she gets pulled into the vortex. After this, Helen and Gotts visit Jennifer's grave. Ending C occurs if Jennifer learns about the secret entrance in the water fountain, but does not learn the words and how to open the door to the vortex. When walking into the caves, Jennifer is stabbed by Kay, who is shown to have known about Edward's true identity all along. In the aftermath, a reporter is outside the castle and reports that many corpses had been found and that there is only one survivor. Edward is brought out on a stretcher and he opens his eyes and smiles. It's assumed that after Kay killed Jennifer, Edward killed Kay too. Finally, ending D for Jennifer's scenario requires her to not save Helen and not find the words and how to open the door to the vortex. Upon entering the tunnel, Edward is in there and says that he's found a way out. As Jennifer walks past him, he stabs her and she dies, with Edward looking at her body. And that's it for Jennifer's scenario. There is a bit to unpack in terms of the Barrows family history, but we'll do that after going through Helen's scenario. Now, the prologue plays out as before, but after giving Professor Barton a piece of her mind, Helen sends Jennifer home and she goes to the police station to speak with Assistant Inspector Gotts, as she's eager to find out if they've had any progress with the Clock Tower murders case. He replies that they've got no leads. He mentions Professor Barton and the fact that he's not really sharing anything with the police in regard to the case. After speaking about Jennifer still suffering nightmares, Helen heads to the Norway International Hotel and speaks with Kay and Edward. Kay says that they've had no real progress as a result of Barton's hypnotherapy, but she says that they'll be staying there in Oslo, as they're expecting great results soon. Helen then goes back to the university as her hard drive has crashed, and she needed to make sure the data on it has been restored so she can finish her dissertation. After talking about it to Danny, who has repaired the hard drive for her, she heads off to take a short 20-minute power nap. Another researcher, Rose, is there in the lounge too, and is having a nap, so Helen gets into one of the bunks. And 20 minutes later, she wakes up to someone lightly knocking on the door. Rose is gone, so Helen answers the door, and to her shock, it's Scissorman. Using a fire extinguisher, Helen blasts the Scissorman with it and hides, and she eventually finds numerous colleagues there. All of the ones who are still in the building have been murdered by the Scissorman. She needs to escape before she, too, is murdered. Finding a pair of pliers, Helen gains access to the ground floor storage room and uses the pliers to get away as she's able to cut through wires holding the door shut. After her escape, a new murder scene has been set up at the university. Gotts is furious as he can't believe more murders are happening before he's even had a chance to investigate the previous ones. He expresses his doubt that it was really Scissorman and accuses Helen of daydreaming like Jennifer did. He tells Helen she can go home but tells her not to go anywhere, as he'll probably have to call her in again for more questioning. Helen turns to Jennifer and tells her they should both keep looking for clues about the Scissorman, as if they don't do something, he'll probably end up killing them. Afterwards, Helen starts to try and find out more clues regarding the Scissorman. She goes to speak with Kay and Edward at the hotel. Kay is worried that Scissorman will try to go after Edward and says that he's currently at the library. Before going to the library though, Helen goes to the university as the crime scene has been cleared and speaks to Beth. She wants to have a look at the demon idol statue to see if it has any clues towards the Scissorman. But Beth shares the news that it's been sent off to be looked at by someone else, either Dr. Sullivan or Rick, the former butler. After this, she goes to give Gotts the update, and as he's going to see Rick and ask him some questions about the Barrows family, he offers to ask Rick about the statue for her. As in Jennifer's scenario, this ending is tied to the decision the player made earlier on, in choosing where Professor Barton would send the statue, to Rick or to Dr. Sullivan at the library. Again, whatever the player chooses, in order to achieve this ending, the player must go against their earlier decision. In my playthrough for Helen, I had Professor Barton send the statue to the library. So if Helen accepts Gotts' help there in asking Rick about the statue, the gameplay will switch to Gotts questioning Rick at his home in the suburbs. Rick once again is killed, but by his dog this time as it mauls him to death. Scissorman inevitably shows up and tries to kill Gotts, and even after Gotts shoots Scissorman repeatedly, he's still not down. After the statue is not there and Gotts escapes Rick's house, the trail runs cold, and Helen later finds Jennifer dead in her room, stabbed in the back of the neck with a standard pair of scissors. That's ending E, but let's rewind and choose to decline Gotts' help in finding the statue. Declining Gotts' help, Helen goes to the library, 1, to check on Edward, and 2, to ask Dr. Sullivan about the statue. Says that Professor Barton dropped off the statue and left it with him, and tells Helen to pick it up when she leaves. After doing some research on the Lords of Northern England, the library is soon to close, so Helen packs up and gets ready to leave. The clock tower bell starts to chime, so Dr. Sullivan goes to check it out. Dr. Sullivan dies a grisly death, and Scissorman shows up. Evading him, Helen then heads into the exhibit room behind Dr. Sullivan's office, and thankfully, the statue is there, so she picks it up. Helen sees Edward in the back office and escorts him to the reading room. Grabbing the screwdriver from the office, she opens up the vent, and Edward is able to escape through it. The police have showed up, and Helen sees Assistant Inspector Gotts. She collapses in his arms, and they both leave the library. Not long after this harrowing ordeal, Helen is speaking with Gotts at the police station, and she tells him that she learned something interesting about the Scissorman and the location of Barrows Castle, and that it's where the Barrows family were from before they emigrated to Norway. She says that she found out about a monster being born there at the castle, and that they must have found a way to get rid of Scissorman all those years ago. Helen says she's planning to go to England and to the castle, but Gotts objects, saying that it's too dangerous. Saying that they have no choice, Gotts relents and says that he'll go with her. Helen then goes round to gather up anyone that may be interested in going to England and to the castle. After gathering as many people as possible and landing in England, they set off for the English countryside. Setting up camp is not long before people have gone missing. Harris, Edward and Jennifer have all vanished. Helen and Gotts hurry to the castle, surmising that they may be there. Arriving at the castle, Helen narrowly avoids a grim death, as the castle begins to tremble and part of the floor gives way. Emerging into the main hall, Helen explores the castle, and she encounters Harris in the kitchen, and he doesn't really seem all that scared of Scissorman. He says he has a hunch, but that he doesn't think that Scissorman is after him at all, that he's just after Helen. He gives her a key for a fireplace somewhere in the castle. Helen also finds a terrified Tim hiding in the wine cellar. She finds Nolan, who has been placed inside a large stone coffin. After freeing him, he says that his head hurts. She comes across an injured Gotts too, who, after staunchly denying any kind of belief in the supernatural, appears to have changed his view after seeing the ghosts of many children, all of them terrorized and killed by the Scissorman years and years ago. Gotts gives Helen a gun, should she need to use it. So we're coming up to the part now with the endings, so before we go any further, it's time to go back a bit and look at the Barrows family history. The Scissorman's origins come from an evil god that was worshipped by the Barrows family, who was called the Great Father. In the novelization of the game, the Great Father was worshipped by Theodore Barrows, who feared death, and worshipped the Great Father to gain immortality. However, this immortality did not attach itself to the flesh, but only the soul. The Great Father wanted sacrifices, hence the dead crows in the mansion in Clock Tower the first fear. Even after the death of Theodore Barrows, the Barrows family would be tainted and cursed for centuries to come, in the form of the Scissorman. In the 13th century, the head of the household at the time was Quentin Barrows. One day, Quentin decided to take a stand. This was because a monster was born there at the castle, a child named John Barrows. John was the one who had terrorized the local children and would kill them, hence all of the bones in this room. Sacrifices to the aforementioned Great Father. Eventually, Quentin only saw one thing that he could do, and that was to kill his son, John, in order to stop him from killing others, burying his body in a stone coffin. He would then leave hints and instructions all over the house in order to help people who may find themselves in this situation again in future. Quentin would be then labelled a traitor for betraying the family's calling, I guess. Centuries later, after they'd moved to Norway, the Barrows family member Mary would give birth to the two boys, devil children, Bobby and Dan Barrows. The curse continued. And that, of course, leads us into the game, The First Fear. Whilst exploring the castle, Helen also finds a phantom hand inside a drawer which tries to strangle her, a note about a spell that is used to exorcise the devil children, a strange book with a cover made of copper which opened up a passage and led her to Gotts, an old note inside a fireplace which featured a door spell written in Latin which, according to the author, can be used to exorcise Scissorman. She finds a wooden box, and after burning it, it gives her a small key for a cosmetics box, and inside that cosmetics box is a sketched map which mentions a hidden passage in the fountain. And this leads us to ending A. Hearing Jennifer's voice calling out from inside the chapel, Helen uses the gun that Gotts gave her and shoots the large padlock off the door to the chapel. Inside, she sees Jennifer there on the cross. Scissorman is there too, and Helen only has a limited time to act before Scissorman kills Jennifer. Using the gun again, she shoots Scissorman, wounding him, and he scurries off bleeding into the back room. Getting Jennifer down and making sure she's okay, Helen goes after the Scissorman. The Scissorman is revealed to have been Professor Barton. He explains and says that due to his work doing criminal psychology, it triggered something inside of him, and he was drawn in by Scissorman's evil soul. Helen says that there's no danger of that happening to her, as she's not like Barton, and then Barton dies. Heading back to Jennifer, Helen speaks with the now recovered Gotts, who says that the case is solved as it was Barton who was the Scissorman and that he's now dead. And Helen replies that the case isn't solved at all, as Barton was simply doing Scissorman's bidding. The real Scissorman is still there in the castle. Finally, Helen drains the fountain in the courtyard and heads down the ladder. She's confronted by the real Scissorman, Edward or Dan Barrows, who has killed Kay and chases Helen across the bridge. Reciting the door spell, the large doors open and Scissorman is sucked into the vortex, but he grabs Helen and is in danger of pulling her in too. Thankfully, Gotts shows up and aims a well-placed shot, hitting Scissorman with him flying into the vortex, the door closing and Helen being saved. In the aftermath, Jennifer is helped out of the wreckage by Helen, surrounded by reporters and the local authorities. The game then ends. But there are 3 more endings, B, C and D, as we've already covered ending A and ending E. To achieve ending B, if Jennifer is killed by Scissorman in the chapel and Helen learns of the secret fountain entrance, the same thing happens down in the caves, except Helen is pulled into the vortex with the Scissorman. In the aftermath, a reporter is covering what happened, and then the Scissorman's hand comes up from underneath the rubble. To achieve ending C, if Helen used the fireplace key given to her by Harris, Jennifer dies in the chapel, and Helen doesn't learn that Professor Barton has been pretending to be the Scissorman. Helen gets the map detailing the location of the fountain entrance, but going down into the tunnel to the caves, Professor Barton is in there and tells Helen that he's found something that solves the case, but as she's walking in front of him, he hits her over the head with a rock, killing her. In the aftermath, Assistant Inspector Gotts visits Helen's grave. To achieve ending D, Helen saves Jennifer in the chapel by shooting Scissorman, finding out that he's Barton, but she does not find the cosmetics key, therefore does not learn about the secret fountain entrance. She says that Barton was the Scissorman and that the case is now closed. The game then ends. And that's it for the story of Clock Tower, The First Fear and Clock Tower. For my honest opinion on this game, meh, it was okay. Scissorman was cool at first, but in the PS1 game at least, it got pretty tiring pretty fast. Nonetheless, I'm glad that I played through another slice of classic horror. I'm glad that I now have this piece of timeless physical media for my game collection. But if you enjoyed this breakdown of the story from Clock Tower, First Fear and Clock Tower 1, then please leave a like on the video and subscribe if you aren't already. But for now, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.